You see all these folk coming in to enjoy our latest Kohima Educational Trust webinar. That's really exciting. We've got a cracking historian all the way from down under for you tonight, or in Andrew's case this morning. I can see lots of our old friends from around the world, lots and lots of different countries coming in, so you're more than welcome. I'm just going to ensure that everyone's getting in safely and remind you of what we need to do. So if you want to chat amongst yourselves, then use the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you want to raise questions, then please do that as well. And if we have time at the end, Andrew and I will be very happy to answer any questions that you've got. But if not, then what we'll do is we'll go and make sure that we answer them by email. And yes, welcome everybody. Some old hands coming in to join us tonight, which is very exciting. And I think that's enough for me. I'll hand over to Sylvia.
Never enough from you, Rob, but thank you. And welcome everybody. Hello. And as Rob said, welcome to another KET webinar. And tonight it's our great pleasure to introduce author and historian Dr Andrew Kilsby, who has literally gone out of his way to be with us this evening. Andrew lives in Melbourne, and I thought I'd worked out what time it would be in Melbourne today because it's before the clocks go back in the UK. But no, in Australia, the clocks have already gone forward or back. So he actually got up at 5 o'clock this morning to be with us. So thank you, Andrew. It's hugely appreciated. But for us, it will be worth it. Tonight, Andrew will take us through his research about aircrew who were forced to land away from their bases due to mechanical failure, enemy action, or misadventure, and who faced very uncertain outcomes. Many were killed or died of wounds in unforgiving crash landings or accidents. Some were never heard of again or were never recovered, including those lost at sea. Some were murdered by anti-British Burmese, others taken prisoner by the brutal Japanese, or died in attempts to return to friendly lines. Yet among those aircrew forced down for whatever the reason, there were also some amazing escapes from death, which Andrew will tell us more about tonight. So I hope you're sitting comfortably. Andrew is an Australian professional historian with a focus on military, business, and biographical history. He holds a PhD in history before completing 20 years of military and diplomatic service in Australia and Southeast Asia. His most recent military titles includes In the Fight, Australians and the War in Burma, 42 to 45, and Resolute, the Australian Air War in Burma, also 42 to 45, written with Daryl Moran, which went on sale this autumn and is the subject of our tonight's talk. And as always, as you know, Dr. Robert Lyman will set the scene for us. Do feel free to use the chat button, as I know all of our regulars do. If you have a specific question, it is helpful if you can put this on the Q&A rather than chat if you want it to be answered live on air at the end of the presentation. And I'm sure Rob and Andrew will do their best to do so. Otherwise, we can pick up any other comments afterwards on email. So without further ado, as they say, over to you, Rob. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Sylvia. And it's time really to give Andrew, a good friend, a warm welcome to the Kohima Educational Trust and to tonight's webinar. Just a few additional words to what Sylvia has said. I was briefly or slightly involved in the construction of the previous book that Andrew had written with Daryl Moran, In the Fight, by writing the introduction. And it's a magnificent book. You can get it online. You can get a Zoom. If you're in the UK, you can get a Zoom. You can get a Kindle version in the UK. You can order a hard copy from Big Sky Publications in Australia. And I've watched the birth of this latest book, Resolute, which talks about the Australian Air War in Burma. Now, this is interesting, isn't it? Because the Royal Australian Air Force wasn't in Burma, yet lots of Australians were. And it's a really interesting feature of the Commonwealth, the Empire during the Second World War, that so many individuals from various countries Canada, South Australia, South America, sorry, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, and so on, ended up flying and fighting in the Indian Air Force or the Royal Air Force in this particular theatre of war. So it's a nuance that not everyone is completely au fait with. The story, of course, is one of gradual build-up from quite dramatic weakness in 1942 to really quite remarkable power. Many of you will know of Shri Nair. We've got to get Shri on this webinar process, Sylvia, in due course, because he can tell the story of the Indian Air Force. And it's an extraordinary story of growth, but it's also the story of individual courage and bravery in quite extraordinary adversity. And that's really what Andrew's going to be talking to us about tonight. The air war is not a part of the Burma campaign that we hear a lot about, and that's a terrible mistake because, as Bill Slim said, theirs was as much an air war as a ground war, and it's important that we recognize that. That's enough for me. Andrew, I'm delighted to give you the chair, and we're looking forward very much to what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Rob, and Sylvia for that nice introduction as well. It's always a pleasure to be in a chat room with you, albeit 11,000 kilometres away. And it is early in the morning, which I'll never forgive you for, but we'll come back to that later. Hello, everybody. Andrew Kilsby. We're going to talk about some short stories in the air war in Burma. They're not all about Australians. Which reminds me, Rob, we mustn't forget the Canadians had exactly. Quite a few airmen and their own squadrons in that Southeast Asia theatre. First of all, let's talk about the major causes of uncertain outcomes. First and probably the most important in these terms is weather and terrain. And I just want to set the scene for weather because it was often said that weather caused more casualties in this theatre for airmen than enemy action. So I'm going to just read a couple of short stories on weather that will set the scene for this. First of all, a C-47 Dakota of 52 Squadron RAF flying from Dinjan in Assam over to Kunming in China in 1945, the so-called over the hump, or the aluminium trail, littered with the bodies of aircraft that crashed mostly because of weather. The aircraft ran into cloud after the first ridge at 8,000 feet. There they met rime, ice, snow, and finally a belt of clear ice at 11,700 feet. This flight was cancelled. This is why. Quote, ice began to form on the leading edges, but the ice boots threw most of it off. But then it formed around the base of the cylinders, and one motor started to pack up. So we headed back south for Myitkyina. There we were tossed about in some of the worst turbulence I've ever experienced. We were thrown about so much that twice we were on the point of stalling, and finally we stalled completely. Electrical disturbances blew a relay in the main radio set, filling the radio compartment with sparks. We were still in cloud and losing height, so I ordered the crew to put on their parachute harness and sent my number 2 and the wireless operator back to throw out the cargo, mainly medical supplies. Over Myitkyina, the bad motor picked up. So we climbed to 13,000 feet, still in rime ice and cloud, and went back to our base. We had been in ice and cloud for 4 hours. Now I'll tell the story of a Catalina of 628 Squadron, which was a special duties squadron. Special duties meaning clandestine or moonlight flight squadron, 1944. It was on my 13th meteorological trip that we ran into one of these intertropic fronts, fearsome. We got into it somewhere coming back to India, and it's the most helpless feeling. You can have the stick hard back, full throttle on, and you're going down at 2,000 feet a minute, and there is just nothing you can do. I had someone else sitting in the seat, not the second pilot, but I called out to him to alter my compass for 180 degrees so that I could go out accurately on a plot. I couldn't take my hands off the control column to do it myself. because she was being thrown about like a leaf in the storm, pitched everywhere. I got the navigator to come up and he put it on. I tried to turn around backwards and go at 180 degrees the other way, but we kept going down and down and down. We must have hit, I think, an air cushion there just near the surface of the sea, and suddenly it seemed to be easing off, but it is the most helpless feeling. The crew told me afterwards that they'd got the dinghy out of its cover and put it into the blister compartment ready to launch if we hit the sea. Hopefully we'd all be able to get out, but you might not have. Later that night, when we finally got back, the navigator said, "Your face was yellow with fear." Yellow was the term he said, not white, but I must have gone through white, I think. Oh, it was a terrifying moment, terrifying. The aeroplane shaking, you'd think it'd shake to bits. The wings of these Catalinas are about 104 feet wide, and you know they'd flutter. You'd wonder whether the thing was going to break apart. You offer up a prayer, I tell you. Make instant Christians of you. It was a frightening experience. And of course, over the land, the terrain, the cloud base often came down below the height of the mountain ranges that the aircraft had to fly over. And so terrain became a very important problem for pilots in all types of aircraft, sometimes not knowing, and many did not, that they were going to run into a hill in the cloud. The next thing is enemy action. There was air combat, both day and night. The Japanese had night fighters as well. Fighter aircraft on the Japanese side were mainly Oscars, very rarely Zeros, only in Ceylon when the naval attack occurred in April 42. And sometimes over the hump, where Japanese aircraft operating out of Myitkyina managed to intercept occasionally mainly USAF Dakotas flying over the hump. There was always ground fire, of course, small arms fire doing ground attack, but also when you start hitting the important targets like railway yards, airfields, ports, the anti-aircraft fire was much heavier, often with master cone lights and so on. And occasionally you'd run foul of a Japanese trap, such as wire, stretched across waterways when they knew that Allied aircraft, particularly fighter bombers, were looking for and strafing up river craft that were transporting supplies and logistics. And a few Beaufighters, mosquitoes and so on got caught up and got hit by, or they ran into these wires and crashed. Pilot error. It is no surprise to anyone who's followed air warfare in World War II that pilot error was a big issue, and there were many, many accidents that probably could have been avoided in other circumstances. Inexperience, overconfidence, youth. Some of our pilots were as young as 20 years old. Disobeying orders or ignoring the physical limitations of their aircraft. Mid-air and runway collisions, hitting telegraph lines or running into terrain, as we mentioned before. Mechanical failure. We'll talk about one story where a Blenheim crashed because its propeller fell off mid-flight, returning to base. In the Mosquitoes, for example, the adhesives that kept the wooden framework together was affected by the tropical weather, and several planes crashed, just broke up in the air because before they discovered what the issue was. And other aircraft fully bombed up or full of sea mines to deliver to Japanese-held estuaries and so on, taking off and crashing within 2 kilometres, a mile or so from the end of the airstrip. Mid-air collisions, particularly between Liberators, was absolutely catastrophic, where you'd lose over 22 men in the crews in that incident. People running into each other, taking off and landing, very common. Finally, acts of God. And by acts of God, I only mean, as in war, as in any war, simply inexplicable or unexplainable events resulting in catastrophic outcomes, usually caused by one or more of the factors that we looked at just above. So I'm going to talk today just about 8 short vignettes to give some idea of these types of uncertain outcomes. The first is vanished over the hump. Then we have murder and revenge, a learner's guide to escape and evasion, rescued by a white princess, Gurkhas on patrol, naked and free, I'm sure you'll like this one, a thunderbolt strikes the earth, and a black widow bites a buzzard. I'm hoping those titles will get you, keep you watching to see what's coming next. So let's start with vanished over the hump. C-47 Dakotas of 31 Squadron RAF, which was the first transport squadron operating in northern Burma, operating a detachment from Tezpur, which was about 275 miles northeast of Imphal, and from Dinjan in Assam. The unarmed Dakotas flew supply dropping sorties to forward posts at Phalam in northwestern Burma and to remote Fort Hertz in northeast Burma, bringing supplies to support Allied forces and the northern Kachin levies in that area. Less often, 31 Squadron Dakotas often flew over the hump to Kunming in China to support RAF station there, and flying in and across the highly challenging terrain of the hump was no easy task. One of the squadron's Dakotas was one of the early casualties in this treacherous route. More than 600 aircraft crashed trying to get over the hump and back. And on 31st of January 1943, this particular Dakota took off from Dinjan, heading for Fort Hertz on the way to Kunming. Fort Hertz was a tiny spot, the only place with an airfield in Burma that was still held by the Allies, actually, quite remote, but en route to Kunming, and was often used as a point of no return, if you like, but it also helped with navigation to go across it. Now, the aircraft was last seen by a Hudson pilot at 7,000 feet en route to Kunming in China. It was on the right heading, and this was about 30 minutes after takeoff. The aircraft never arrived, and searches for the aircraft failed to find it. In the crew were an Australian pilot and a warrant officer, a wireless operator, and an RAF second pilot, and a Brit, a Canadian wireless operator, an RAF fitter, probably going up to the station in Kunming, and a passenger on special duty, and they just simply disappeared. The special duty passenger, just as a side note, was Flight Lieutenant N.L. Bao. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly, but Baugh MC, RAF. Bao had escaped from Hong Kong, where he was a POW, and had made it through to Allied lines in China, and with the help of Chinese guerrillas, and that's why he got an MC, by the way. He had been repatriated to India, joined 31 Squadron, and was being sent back to work with the Hong Kong Escape Organisation, known as BAG, or the British Army Aid Group. The loss of the aircraft remained unresolved. Just another one of those crashes in the Burma theatre that, just there was never any conclusion to it. That is, until Christmas Day 2017, when the aircraft was found on a freezing hillside in the Himalayas, 80 miles off course to the north of Fort Hertz. It was discovered upside down, with no signs of fire, no bullet holes, and no human remains. Apparently, the mountain bears had seen to that. The team, which was led by an American called Clayton Cools of MIA Recoveries, Inc., which found the aircraft, considered it most likely that the aircraft crashed due to wind shear, as the aircraft bounced around in this combination of bad weather and wind shear. and it just crashed into the mountain eventually. Whether it ran out of fuel, I don't think so. Just one of those things. It's possible that somebody on board managed to walk away, but they wouldn't have survived long in the cold, the crash site being in a forested valley 10,400 feet up in the mountains on the Himalayas, and snow. Only bad weather could explain the crash and the huge deviation from the flight plan. Murder and revenge. A Blenheim crew in mid-1943, and the venerable Blenheims were still flying offensive patrols against targets such as supply dumps, monsoon quarters of the Japanese and other Japanese infrastructure in occupied villages. And on 1st of June 43, a Blenheim of 11 Squadron RAF, piloted by an RAF squadron leader and 2 Australian crew, crashed along the Manipur River in Burma. It was the lead aircraft of 3 Blenheims on a sortie to bomb Kalemyo, south of Imphal and west of Chittagong. During the bomb run-in, other pilots, including a number 2 aircraft, saw the starboard propeller fall off the lead Blenheim. Can you imagine? The other 2 aircraft went on to the mission, bombed Kalemyo, and then searched for the missing aircraft, finding it submerged in the river with only a burning wingtip visible. No sign of the crew. It was later reported by agents that 2 of the crew had been killed in the crash and a 3rd survived but was murdered by local villagers, who then cut up and disposed of all the bodies in the river. This, in fact, turned out not to be true. In fact, all 3 had been murdered and mutilated. At the present time, at that time they were categorized missing, believed killed, but 3 mutilated bodies were found in a nearby river, but identification was impossible. So on 15th of June, as you can imagine, this angered the squadron considerably. 11 Squadron Blenheims under Wing Commander Harley Stum, and Harley actually was an Australian, but he joined the RAF. He was a Rhodes Scholar and an international rugby player, actually, and was in England at university when the war broke out, so he joined the RAF. The squadron came back and bombed the village and systematically strafed it. They were accompanied by 11 Hurricanes of 146 Squadron RAF, which overwatched the attack, then went down themselves and also strafed the village line abreast, making attacks from various directions. Slight machine gun fire from the north end of the village was quickly silenced, which suggests there were some Japanese in that village, and they felt that they had avenged their comrade's murder. Curiously, the 2 Australian crew of the crashed aircraft had been recommended by Stum to be awarded the DFC each about 6 weeks before for their bravery in previous air actions, but nothing had been done about it. So the Air Force, the Australian Air Force liaison officer followed up, and the DFCs were awarded posthumously. Just want to make sure I've got this right. A learner's guide to successful escape and evasion. Often, as you can imagine, crashing for whatever the reason often happened as a surprise to pilots. And some were prepared for the eventuality and kept their head, and others did not. In this case, Flying Officer Ray Jackson, RAF, was flying a Hurricane 2C, a member of 34 Squadron RAF, and they were tasked, the 2C was a Hurry bomber, basically. 6 aircraft were tasked to bomb and strafe a village on the Japanese lines of communication, just across the border in Burma. Jackson bombed the target in a shallow dive, but his aircraft was hit by small arms fire from the ground. He bailed out. By the next morning, he had avoided Japanese patrols but had no food. He trekked during the day and made a shelter and a small fire to dry socks that night. Now, the washing of feet and cleaning of socks was a big factor in getting him out. He found a Naga tribesman, but almost ran into Japanese in that person's village, so managed to avoid that and learnt his mistake from that one. He then travelled for 7 or 8 days using a compass and watch to keep his bearing. I don't know if many of you know that if you, well, at least in the southern hemisphere, if you point 12 o'clock at the sun and the difference between there and the hour hand is north. I'm not sure how that works in the northern hemisphere, but certainly in the southern that works very well. He kept on his bearing and he'd rest every 20 minutes after walking for 3 hours and then repeat until 6 p.m. Always made a shelter, subsisted on jungle food, watched what the monkeys ate and ate that, treated blisters with, now I'll try and pronounce this properly, sulfanilamide from his escape kit, bothered by mosquitoes, leeches, ticks and ants. By the 12th day, he was exhausted and was becoming ill from eating a jungle potato, as he called it. But he fell in, fortunately for him, with friendly Nagas 2 days out of Jessamy. He was then contacted by a V-Force team. The V-Force, of course, are the intelligence gatherers and scouts operating behind the Japanese lines. And they passed him on to others and finally got him out to British positions. In fact, he walked into an airfield and it turned out it was his own squadron at that airfield. They'd moved airfields while he was walking. Now, why is it a learner's guide to successful E&E? Because he was one of the few aircrew ever to return from the jungle through enemy lines. He devised a plan, he followed sensible routes and made a good shelter whenever possible. He'd taken care of his feet, he'd preserved his rations and water and used his survival aids correctly. So at the end, he was awarded an MC for that successful E&E and spent the rest of the war as an instructor at the RAF School for Jungle Self-Preservation Training in India, where he instructed aircrew on the techniques of jungle survival. So Ray Jackson, and I know Sylvia or Rob will tell a story about Ray at the end of this presentation. Rescued by a white princess. An observer in a Vengeance who left an inverted plane in bad weather, parachuting out, was rescued by a white princess and her Nagas. Actually, he did do a bit of walking as well. When Blenheims were taken off operations in 1943, because they were essentially obsolete by that time, many RAAF aircrew were converted to Vengeance dive bombers. I should have said RAF aircrew, including Australians, converted to Vengeance dive bombers. A good photograph here of one about to take off. The Vengeance was a deadly accurate dive bomber, responsible for the destruction of many machine gun posts, bridges, oil and supply dumps and troop installations, greatly admired by the ground forces, the ground units. Typically, the Vengeance would start their dive attack from as high as 12,000 feet and pull out at 3,000 feet. The aircraft could carry 2 500-pound bombs internally and a 250-pound bomb under each wing. But they also needed to have fighter escorts for their sorties, being no match for the maneuverable Japanese Oscars. A new front was opened with the insertion by gliders of Chindit columns to bases hundreds of miles behind Japanese lines. This is Wingate's Operation Thursday. Equipped with dive bombers, 84 Squadron RAF flew almost daily missions, both in support of the Chindit operation and against the Japanese offensive, which was also occurring against Imphal and Kohima. Among a large number of Australian aircrew in the squadron was a flying officer, Robert Gabrielson. He was reported missing on the 6th of April 1944 in the area of Kumbirgam. Rob will be crying listening to this pronunciation, but that's the best I can do. The 84 Squadron Operational Report tells a story. 6 aircraft took off on a strike, but heavy storm clouds obliged them to return to base. A further 6 aircraft took off at the same time, 4 aircraft getting through the cloud banks and bombed the secondary target given. One pilot returned 1 hour and 22 minutes after takeoff, having separated from the formation in the cloud and running into a severe thunderstorm. During his experience in the storm, amongst other aerobatics, he thinks he performed a loop fully bombed up. But unfortunately, his backseater, Gabrielson, the observer, was either thrown out of the aircraft or had released the safety belt and bailed out, excuse me, as he was not there when the pilot regained control. He was posted as missing. However, good news came in from Army units on the 9th of April that he was safe, having been recovered 30 miles northwest of Imphal. He arrived back on the 12th and gave his report. Flying upside down with his head in the slipstream and a feeling that the aircraft was going down. Oh, really? Gabrielson saw no future in that. So he slipped the quick release catch and got out on his very first chute descent. The chute opening below cloud and between ridges of the hills, fortunately for him, a soft landing on bamboo, an encounter with a white princess in a Naga village, this is Gabrielson talking, that found he could keep going on a little boiled rice and 2 biscuits a day, supplemented by 3 good meals over the 5 days he was walking out. So this is a rather intriguing story. And when I read this in the operational report, I was also, well, a white princess in Nagaland? And in fact, yes, there was. This was Ursula Graham Bauer, one of the pioneer anthropologists in that region, in the Naga Hills between 1937 and 1946. And she also was a guerrilla leader of V4 Scouts in 1944, doing her bit against the Japanese. So it really was, for Gabrielson, a serendipitous meeting. And as you can see in these stories, not the first time that friendly tribes people had helped Allied pilots get back to the friendly lines. It didn't always work out that well, however. A Hurricane pilot crashed and walked out only to be killed by a Gurkha patrol. Ground attack was quite hazardous. Hurry bombers often escorted by Spitfires flying top cover, but that didn't protect pilots from ground fire all the same. On 28th of April 1944, a Hurricane 2C pilot, and you can see a good image of this, of a 2C attacking a bridge and communication line down in the valley below. The pilot's name was Bernie Pritchard of 60 Squadron RAF. So he was on a bombing raid. His plane went down. I won't even try and pronounce this one, Rob. It's too difficult. A hill station or a hill town at the highest point of a road, about 40 miles southeast of Imphal. He was one of 12 Hurricanes which had taken off from Palel to bomb and strafe enemy-occupied positions along the Palel-Tamu Road. However, Pritchard's aircraft appeared to have been hit by ground fire and crashed, but Pritchard was seen to bail out and arrive safely on the ground. 2 days later, his body was brought into 42 Indian Field Ambulance, or brought into the field ambulance, where it was clear from his multiple wounds that he'd taken the full force of small arms fire. He had walked out from his crash site only to come across a Gurkha patrol at dawn the next day. Apparently, he ran away from the patrol, perhaps mistaking them for Japanese, almost certainly, but they shot him, thinking he was a Japanese. And of course, in that very early morning, with the mists and his own fear of getting captured by the Japanese, which was almost a fate worse than death for some of the pilots, it was an understandable reaction. The Gurkhas were part of the 20th Indian Division, and the general wrote a letter to the squadron leader, R. Linsell, RAF, I am writing this to express to you and your officers our most heartfelt sorrow at the most unfortunate way in which the very gallant lad who had to bail out the day before yesterday was killed. No one regrets the accident more than the patrol themselves. You have given us so much magnificent support, and we have always felt that when we asked, you tried to give 100%, so that this accident is even more deplorable, and it's a rotten way of repaying you the debt we owe you. Please accept the heartfelt sympathy and sorrow of all ranks of this division, and try, if you can, to forgive us. Signed, Major General Douglas Gracie. The squadron leader sent on this letter to Pritchard's father back in Australia with a cover letter in which he said, inter alia, I can only offer you my most heartfelt sorrow and sympathies, and would ask you to try and forgive and not to condemn the brave troops who were so unfortunately responsible for his death, since it is difficult to realise the very tense conditions under which they have to operate at night, where a false move or a moment's hesitation may mean annihilation. He was buried at the Imphal Military Cemetery, and perhaps, Rob, when you're next there, you should see if you can find it. This is quite a tragic story, but perfectly understandable in the circumstances. Pilot on the run from the Japanese, living on his nerves, and similarly the Gurkha patrol out early in the morning, seeing a figure in the terrain, in the mist, and he ran, they fired, and he ran because he thought they were Japanese, which wasn't the first time, I'm sure, that Gurkhas were mistaken for Japanese. Naked and free. Now, this is a curious story because I still don't understand it, and I'll say why when I get to the end. But a Spitfire pilot, shot down by a Japanese Oscar actually, crashed beyond the Chindwin, but managed to avoid the Japanese and get across the river, but without his clothes, and trekked to safety. I think he did find someone that gave him some clothes eventually, but he was with 615 Squadron RAF, Churchill's own, as they say. Was flying sorties every day in May and June 1944, carrying out offensive patrols, escorting C-47 Dakotas and Vengeance dive bombers, and conducting what they called rhubarbs against Japanese river and road transports, rhubarbs being offensive reconnaissances. 6 new pilots joined the squadron on 19 of May. The squadron operations book noted quite an invasion from down under. There were 6 of them, all Australians. The pilots included Warrant Officer John Payne. Now, he had a twin brother, Arthur, who was also a pilot in the same squadron. They both survived the war, by the way. The squadron suffered grievous losses from 29th of May through June from a variety of different reasons, including 2 of the newly joined pilots. Out of that 6, 2 were gone within a few days. On the 17th of June, John Payne was also shot down and reported missing after a battle with Oscars. 7 Spitfires from the squadron were on a routine patrol south of Imphal from their airfield at Palel when they were diverted to intercept Oscars. While 2 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, and 2 were probably destroyed, Payne was the only one who did not return, although he eventually was recovered several days later. Again, V-Force figures in this story. A British officer with the V-Force of irregulars in the district related in his memoirs years later that Shan villagers brought in an Australian Spitfire pilot who had crash landed on the other side of the Chindwin, and who, as much by luck as by good fortune, had managed to crash land his plane in some elephant grass about 6 miles east of the river. Without any delay, he grabbed his maps and a revolver and fled into the jungle. Within 2 minutes of the landing, he heard voices which he believed to be Japanese in the vicinity of the aeroplane. They may not have been Japanese, may have been, but the pilot nonetheless was pretty anxious. Avoiding all paths, he set off in a westerly direction towards the Chinwin. For a pilot with little or no jungle training, his march must have been an exhausting experience. The pilot reached the riverbank 3 days later and unsuccessfully tried to swim across due to the strong current, but in the process, because he got swept down, could not get back to where he'd left his clothes. Now, I don't know why you would... Okay, who can tell? He was tired and hungry because particularly on the following night, over that night, he spent a pretty miserable night getting eaten alive by mosquitoes. He had no food and he was pretty well exhausted. But finally, with luck, a bit of serendipity, came across an abandoned Japanese supply dump, found a little dinghy and crossed over the Chinwin to a Shan village south of Tongdut. There you go, Rob, Tongdut. In turn, he was passed on to V-Force levies nearby, and from there along the V-Force camps, back through the Japanese lines, returning to his squadron to fly again. Given that the Japanese forces were still besieging Imphal, he was very lucky, clothes or no clothes. It was a good story for the mess. A thunderbolt strikes the earth. A young pilot disobeyed orders and tried to test the speed of his thunderbolt from 37,000 feet. Found himself in an uncontrollable compression dive with fatal results. The Thunderbolt, a significantly larger and more powerful aircraft than both Spitfire and Hurricane, was not easy to master. On 14th of August 1944, Warrant Officer Keith Nodler, a Thunderbolt pilot with 30 Squadron RAF, was killed in a training air accident near Yelahanka, near Bangalore in India. He had been authorised to conduct an individual height climb to 37,000 feet, a straight climb to 30,000 feet, cool his engine if necessary, and continue up to the authorised ceiling. Oddly, he was also, for some reason, he was also told not to fool around. Sounds like a bit of a rogue pilot here. He was just young. At high altitude, a big noise was heard, and the aircraft fell to the ground, shedding pieces of its fuselage, such as the port wing, both elevators, tailplane, and fin. As it did so, it landed on its back. Nodler was found in the cockpit, but to have apparently taken off his helmet, oxygen mask, jettisoned the hood, and released his safety belt. The Court of Inquiry concluded that he had entered a compressibility dive and, realising this and unable to correct it, prepared to bail out, but the disintegration of the aircraft's tail unit and port wing made it impossible for him to get out. Before taking off, Nodler had mentioned to his fitter that he had heard that an American pilot had exceeded 700 miles per hour in a Thunderbolt, and that he was going to see what his own aircraft could do sometime. It was also suggested that oxygen failure and or the presence of carbon monoxide in the cockpits of Thunderbolts at high altitude may have been a factor, as well as a lack of information on compressibility when diving at speed in a Thunderbolt. Aviators were just beginning to learn about the problem ahead of them. A number of crashes occurred due to pilots not fully understanding the aerodynamics at play during a high-speed dive in the Thunderbolt, which, due to its weight, accelerated very quickly, and many paid the ultimate price while getting used to their new steeds. In fact, out of the one of the results of the Court of Inquiry was they decided there wasn't enough information, so they printed a pamphlet to send around to all the Thunderbolt pilots in training about compressibility dives. This particular photograph, by the way, is an RAF pilot. His son, who lives in Adelaide in Australia, gave it to me. It's a beautiful aircraft and it's a beautiful picture. I really like this one. Okay, the last one, a black widow bites a buzzard. Special duty liberators, by special duty, if you recall, I meant clandestine or moonlight flights, but delivering French agents to Indochina via Chinese airspace on Operation Buzzard. The US Air Force wasn't told politics, and I'll explain that in a minute, and P-61 Black Widows, night fighters, may have shot down 3 of the liberators. In January and February 1945, a number of special duty sorties by liberators saw aircraft and crews lost, presumed to be from bad weather or Japanese anti-aircraft fire. Over 22-23 January 1945, 11 liberators of 358 Squadron RAF, operating out of Digri in India, conducted the squadron's first special duties sorties under Operation Buzzard to a variety of targets in Indo-China. 6 were to drop canisters, etc., to Force 136 or Special Operations Executive operatives in the Hanoi area. Quite a long flight. 3 liberators and their crews did not return. Nothing was heard from the aircraft after takeoff, and that's not surprising because they were on radio silence. Other crews returning from the mission, however, reported very adverse weather conditions covering the target area. The aircraft and crew were not found after the war. The missing crew are recorded as having no known missing crews. One of the aircraft crashed in the Chin Hills near Kalemyo as it returned from the mission. This was assumed to be caused, like the others, from bad weather. That may not have been the cause of the crash, however, especially given that the later description was that the aircraft crashed in flames, that is to say, it was flaming as it went in. Bad weather may also not have been the reason for the loss of the other 2 liberators. The United States Air Force, due to politics over whether the RAF should be using Kunming in China as a refueling stop to deliver French agents and supplies to guerrillas in Indochina, and the reason for this, of course, was that President Roosevelt and the Americans in general, the government policy was they didn't want to support the French regaining its pre-war empire, or colonial possessions in Indochina, and so therefore were very unhappy about the British taking French officers and agents into Indochina. So they could still use, that is to say, 358 Squadron could still use Chinese airspace, but they just didn't tell the Americans they were going through it because they didn't want to upset anyone. In fact, it got to such a state with the Americans that French agents were actually dressed in British Army or RAF uniforms through Kunming earlier on to get them to Indochina. Now, because the British and the Americans operated independently to some extent, the lack of communication eventually led to the loss of 3 liberators. They were shot down by fighters of the US 14th Air Force, which mistook them for Japanese bombers, presumably. Even the RAF liaison officer with the 14th Air Force in Kunming had not been informed of the mission owing to the political situation. Post-war, it became known that these liberators were shot down by the Northrop P-61 Black Widow night fighters, probably from the 427th Night Fighter Squadron, operating at the time both out of Myitkyina in Burma and Kunming and Swishan in China. Curiously, a history of the P-61 noted that the 427th had actually, this is their report, had shot down a US consolidated C-87 Liberator Express, which is a cargo plane, US Air Force, which was in a prohibited area and made no radio calls, typically for an SD flight to have that situation. And it just happened to be the same night as the other 358 Squadron Liberators were lost. Now, this incident, there's been some reports of it, but I don't think it's ever been brought, fully investigated, shall we say, particularly in the US. So it remains somewhat of a mystery. Certainly one of the liberators, and possibly all 3, were shot down by the Black Widows. So that ends my little presentation of vignettes. I hope I can't say enjoyed them, but I hope you found them interesting. And I'll now hand back to Sylvia, I guess, or Rob, I'm not sure.
Well, I'll just clear up some of the questions. There's been some really interesting chat. Well, thank you very much, Andrew, in the first instance, for a fabulous look at the air war. It should be, well, it's a taster, isn't it, for everyone to go away and do some more investigations, and certainly to read Resolute. It's now available, certainly in the UK. You can get it on Kindle, as I said. There are some fascinating stories. I mean, Sylvia and I, of course, and a few others knew Ray Jackson, what an extraordinary character he was, and what an amazing escape. But some of the other stories are really quite remarkable, and they're quite extraordinary. A couple of questions from a chap who clearly knows his aircraft, Christopher Watts. He asks a question about the Spitfires. Of course, Spitfire, Christopher, didn't actually get out to India until late 1943. And I've just noticed that Andy Johnson, who's a bit of an expert on the subject, of course, has responded to that. The early Spitfires, the Mark 8s, I think they were, didn't actually perform very well because they weren't designed for the air humidity, the temperatures in Southeast Asia. But the later versions were absolutely magnificent. There's a question here: how did aircrew in Burma navigate? Do you know that, Andrew? Was radio navigation already in use, or was navigation mainly by a whiz wheel?
Well, if you're talking the US Air Force and the British Air Force, the RAF, of course, had different radio types. One was just trying to remember the names for it, but one was wireless transmission and one was radio telegraph or something. So that when they were flying over the hump, for example, that's one of the reasons why they had difficulties, because they weren't compatible in their communications. I think that got sorted out in time. In terms of fighter aircraft and so on, they were certainly from late 43 onwards, they were getting vectored by radar. Initially, of course, late 42, early 43, they really didn't have any radar. And what they did have was around Calcutta, mainly to protect it from Japanese attacks, and also to try and that's why the Spitfires arrived, really, because the Dyna air reconnaissance aircraft, which flew fast and high, couldn't be caught essentially by Allied aircraft until the Spitfires came, and that's one of the things they did manage to do. But the Spitfires and the Oscars were certainly, they were at least an equal aircraft, but of course both had different performance factors at play. So at some points the Spitfires were better, but the Oscars were also very good as well. Now, going back to navigation. So as the air war continued into 43 and towards the end of 43, radar was certainly coming on board, and they were vectored, not always successfully, as they were in the European theatre, towards groups of aircraft coming from the Japanese side. Sometimes 50 to 80 aircraft, a bit hard to miss on a radar, but pilots would often get confused by the terrain if they were going by terrain features, because it was very difficult to find one river as the same as another river in that mountainous terrain, in northern Burma particularly. That's not a very satisfactory answer for you, I'm afraid, but it's the best I can do for now.
Well, Christopher's gone and given a few more very quickly then. Were there any air aces of Burma? I think the answer to that is no. Allied or Japanese, were there any equivalents?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Well, on the Japanese side, of course, the pilots that arrived in Burma were all highly experienced pilots. They'd been fighting in China since 1937. They'd been involved in the Pacific War, Malaya, Singapore, and so on, up until that point as well. So they're very highly experienced. Some aces were already there as aces before they even, when they first invaded Burma. And several of the RAF pilots became aces in their own right. I think 5 enemy aircraft was, full on destroyed was the aces standard. So yes, there were several, and there were a couple of Australians in among that lot. And you'd need to read Resolute to find them, but they're in there. But of course, most people in a squadron, in a squadron of say 12 or 16 aircraft, not everyone was an ace. Most were workaday pilots. They were good at their job, but the aces, of course, were really, out of the ordinary. Those men. But of course, in war, in the air, a lot of it's to do with luck as well.
Brilliant. Another question from Christopher. Was Michina the main Japanese airbase in North Burma, which is why it became such an important target for Merrill's marauders? Well, I'll answer this. Yes, it was the main airbase, but of course, by the end of 1943, early 1944, the Japanese Air Force had diminished dramatically in size, and it wasn't the reason for the target for the Northern Combat Area Command. Michina was right on the route of the Stillwell Road, and it was the natural target for the first stepping stone of Stillwell into northern Burma itself.
I think also with Michina, it was by capturing the airfield, it also prevented the Japanese Air Force, such as it was, to intercept any longer any over the hump flights by the unarmed Dakotas and so on.
Yes, that's absolutely right. That's a very good point. George Wilton says, looking at records from Operation Thursday, etc., it seems that the Curtis Commando was never used for airdrops. Is there a reason why? Well, I can guess, but Andrew, do you have any idea?
Sorry, what was the name of the aircraft?
The Curtis Commando. C-46.
Oh, okay. Well, we know that at the landing grounds like Broadway and so on, that there were certainly Dakotas going in and offloading and getting out again. But I think it was a combination of both. I mean, they obviously weren't flying in every day into the small airstrips. It was hazardous. They did have Spitfires stationed there at some point until the Japanese drove them out. But there didn't seem to be, when I read the operational reports of 31 Squadron and 194 Squadron RAF, both Dakota squadrons, for example, they were doing air supply drops virtually every day during that period. And the United States Air Force folks in the, I think it was called the Air Cargo Task Force, something like that, combined US and RAF aircraft. Similarly, there were literally hundreds of sorties a week by these various aircraft. So I can only assume it was a combination of both airdrop and landing. But I haven't made reference in Resolute to that type of aircraft, and I'm not familiar particularly with it as an airdrop aircraft.
I think I'm guessing here, but having studied the C-46 before, it's the type of aircraft that crashed over Panksha in August 1943. It was a new aircraft in 1943. It had lots of problems, but it was dedicated to the air route over the hump and not to Thursday. Those 300 aircraft in Thursday were the transport aircraft were C-47s. A couple of little comments here from John Hinchcliffe, who first took me around Burma in 2005. Reference 42 Squadron, they suffered glycol leaks done by ground fire. And my old mate, he says, recalls losing his wingman near Katha, never found him. And he also said they always had to wear their boots flying. That must have been a real challenge. And he makes the observation that Ginger Lacey was an ace. And I think you're right, John, he was. They're the questions. There's a very interesting chat in the chat box, and I do have a little look at that. But I think that's all from us, Sylvia. I think we can move on and look at the other slides.
Brilliant, thank you, Rob. And yes, I will circulate, Andrew, the chat afterwards when we finished. But what a brilliant presentation! And I know everyone watching tonight has been going into the chat to say how much they've enjoyed it and what different stories, tragic and unusual, and the research that's gone into it. It's fascinating. And I wanted to thank you for including the story of Ray Jackson. And glad that his story is being told once again. He's an old friend. He was an old friend of KET. That's how we got to know him. And KET's pledge to honour the debt of honour that was owed to the Nagas. And Ray felt that so much he owed his life to the Nagas from this particular village, in particular this couple. And my husband and I, we found the village of Pek and we visited it several times. And we visited the pastor. And Ray wanted us to tell them that he wanted to give them something, that whatever the village wanted. And the village decided they wanted a basketball court to be built. And if you can imagine the hillsides that exist in Nagaland, flat land is at a premium. But Ray donated the money for a basketball court in Pek, and KET made it happen. And it's there and used very much to this day. But that is just one story, and it was amazing to hear tonight about the many other stories of those who survived and those who didn't. And I love the guy on the Chindwin, absolutely amazing. We've already plugged Resolute, but here's the cover. And if you lucky enough to live in Australia, just trot down to your local Dimmocks or Big W and they will have a copy. Or Mel has already posted the Amazon link to get it as an ebook in this country. But it's more of what you've heard tonight. Brilliant book, so I do recommend it. And to remind you that all that we have a wide selection of books available on our online shop, titles from other webinars, previous webinars, Thunder Run, the subject of the next one, Jungle Warrior. And we also have a selection of second-hand books donated to the Trust, which have been, marvelously received, and quite rare titles like the Nunchigum, particularly when they're signed, which this copy is. So if you're interested to have a look at what we have available, do just go online. And we also, of course, have a wide range of lovely, pretty Naga-made items, all made in Nagaland, which we bring back, bracelets and bags, shawls, purses. And again, go and have a look. Lovely stocking fillers for Christmas. I hope you enjoy. Our next webinar is on Thursday, November the 27th, when Dr. Richard Duckett and Duncan Gilmore will be taking us through the fascinating story of Colonel Peacock, Duncan's grandfather, and Colonel Peacock's role in SOE. So we hope very much that you will join us then. But in the meantime, thank you for being part of the evening tonight. We couldn't do it without you. So on behalf of us all, thank you so much and see you next time. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.